Good morning from Brooks River, Katmai National Park, Alaska. My name is Mike Fitz, and I'm a fellow with Explore.org. In just a minute, I'm going to be giving a live play-by-play style broadcast from the mouth of Brooks River. There are many bears within my line of sight, so I'll be narrating the bear and salmon activity here in just a few minutes. Good morning from Brooks River, Katmai National Park, Alaska. My name is Mike Fitz, and I'm a fellow with Explore.org and the Bear Cams. In just a moment, I'm going to be giving a live play-by-play style broadcast from the Brooks River. So please stand by. I'll be talking about all the bears and salmon that I can see within my line of sight, and there's several bears swimming around this morning. Well, good morning from Brooks River, Katmai National Park, Alaska. My name is Mike Fitz. I'm a fellow with Explore.org and the Bear Cams in 2018. And I'm standing on an elevated wildlife viewing platform at the mouth of Brooks River. This is a great time of the year to be out in this location because there are so many bears that use this area to fatten up before winter. So within my line of sight right now, I can see about a half dozen bears, and I know there's at least one small cub hiding in the forest on the other side of the river too, so I'm going to be looking for that bear. During this broadcast, I will be talking a lot about the bears that I see, the salmon that I see, maybe some bird life, and anything else that happens to come around, but I won't be monitoring the comments on Explore.org or Facebook or some other place where you might be watching this right now. But hopefully I'll be able to answer as many of the questions that you might have about this place as possible. A lot of those basic questions about what the bears are doing. So there are 3 bears, including one mother, out in the mouth of the river. They're all kind of dots, and I'll zoom in from time to time to give you a better look at those. I'm going to pan upstream to give you a view of what I am seeing here, because right down below me is one young bear, and on the other side of the river there's also a younger bear on the grass eating a fish. And we're going to take a look at this bear here, because at this time of the year it is a period of time where bears really just have to scavenge their fish. At this area, the water is very deep here. It's very easy for salmon to escape, and for that reason, really the bears in this area are just looking for anything that can't swim away. Many of the salmon that have come into the Brooks River are in the act of spawning or already have finished spawning. This is definitely the peak of the spawning period here in Brooks River for sockeye salmon, silver salmon, and other species. And salmon are anadromous, so when they're born in fresh water, they go to the ocean, they come back to spawn, and then they die here. They do not return out to the sea. So this is their final destination. Even spawned out fish, however, give bears an opportunity to make a living. And down here, scavenging can be quite a productive endeavor. So this is a young bear. It's hard to tell just how big it is because there's, in your frame there's no sense of scale. But this is a bear probably that's only about a 2.5-year-old or so. You can see he has fairly blonde ears. It does resemble an adult female that had some cubs last year who's on her own, and I think that female's out in the mouth of the river. We might try to get a look at her a little in a little bit, but this could be one of her emancipated offspring from last year. So it could be a bear completing its first summer, but it's also giving us a very good example of just how bears fish in this area, especially younger bears. Not all of them have learned how to dive for fish. If they dive for fish, it's sometimes a bit more efficient for them to catch those scraps that are laying on the bottom. But they'll spend significant amounts of time at this time of the year scavenging for fish. So a very sort of classic lower Brooks River scene right now. They may consume all of the fish. They may consume just part of it. It depends really on how fresh the fish is, how hungry they are. The morning here at Brooks River, right as the sun rises at this time of the year, is a fantastic time to be out watching wildlife, because the bears get hungry just like us. They wake up in the morning and they want to get their bellies full, especially since they're in a season of hyperphagia, which is excessive eating at this time of the year. They need to eat as much as they can to put on as many pounds as possible before they go into their den, because once they're in their den, they won't eat, they won't drink, they won't urinate, they won't defecate. So they're going to be solely dependent on their body fat for subsistence in the wintertime. So that one younger bear we were watching is moving over towards another younger bear. Most of the bears that I'm seeing within my line of sight, again, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's at least 7 within my line of sight right now. 8, excuse me. And most of those are younger bears, juvenile bears. Those are the sub-adult bears that we like to call those. That means that they're independent of their mothers, but they're not fully mature. So they're not sexually mature yet. These younger bears, and on the far side that we're looking at right now, again, maybe about 2.5 years old, so they could be about their first on their own for their first summer. They still have a lot of learning to do, a lot of lessons that they're trying to apply that they learned from their mother, but they're exploring their world, trying to find their own home ranges, their own way to survive. They can also be quite playful too, especially when well fed. So we'll watch for any interactions between these two to see, or between these bears to see maybe how friendly or not so friendly they are. So those two bears, walked, or the one from the water walked up to the other one and just kind of walked away, and that's not uncommon, especially if the bears are familiar with one another and they're not necessarily feeling ready or willing to displace another bear, or if they don't even feel like playing. Sometimes they will engage in some pretty vigorous play fights. There will be quiet times during the broadcast too, where I'm looking around. I'm using my binoculars to scan the area to see what else might be in the vicinity. Before she disappears out of line of sight, I want to pan down stream here, go across the river. So this bear that's moving out of our line of sight is a mother bear, and she has one first-year cub that's presumably on the beach. I saw her just for a moment come out with her cub before the broadcast, and then her cub disappeared into the forest as she continued to fish. So her cub is in that vicinity. We'll be looking for her from time to time. First-year cubs generally are quite dark at this time of the year. They can be almost blonde, though, from time to time. And I know there was one cub seen last night on the cams that was quite blonde. But first-year cubs usually very small, very dark, comparison to yearlings or 2.5-year-olds, which we sometimes see. There's a canoe out in the water. That canoe is at least 100 yards from any bear. This actually canoe contains a couple of employees that are commuting to work. It's not a normal thing, but there are too many bears in the way of the floating bridge that's near me for them to actually walk through to get to their duty station this morning. So they decided to jump in a boat, paddle across. And then there are a couple of bears fishing in the mouth of the river. The one on the left, looking through my binoculars, is a large adult female. If she gets out of the water, we'll see that she's very fat, but she may not. At this time of the year, again, bears are very comfortable in the water. This is where their food is. They have so much body fat on them as well that they don't really tend to get cold in the water like we do. So very large objects, they tend to cool down a lot slower than someone like me, or smaller objects. So just think about a pot of water on the stove. If you have a gallon of boiling water versus a cup of boiling water, which one is going to cool down faster? Certainly the smaller volume is going to cool down faster. And brown bears really are well adapted to cold temperatures. So when they go into the den in the wintertime, they're not necessarily avoiding cold weather. They're avoiding famine more than anything else. So very comfortable in the water, ample body reserves that help to keep them warm in the water, and also float as well. And the one out in the water here, this is number 409 Bead Nose. A lot of our bears here have some nicknames. They're all assigned numbers by our bear monitoring staff in that program. And if you want to know more about the bears of Brooks River and you're not familiar with maybe some of the individual animals that I'll be talking about this morning, please go to Katmai's website or just type in Katmai ebook into any search engine, and the Bears of Brooks River ebook should be the first thing that shows up. And you can download that book. It's over 100 pages, but it contains a large amount of great information about the ecology of these bears, their habits, and also information on the individuals. 409 has been here visiting the river for about 20 years now. So she's a very experienced female. She knows what she's doing. She knows where to go. She knows that the mouth of the river at this time of the year is the perfect place to scavenge for dead fish. And if she's not in the water fishing, she's usually up on the bank sleeping. So especially the adult bears at this time of the year, their activities sort of reflect that pattern: feeding and then sleeping. Younger bears will actually engage in maybe some other activities like playing, but adults are much less likely to play. Older adults, I should say, are much less likely to play than younger bears. And to give you an example of a play fight, I'm going to pan north here. Excuse me, or not north. Looking north right now, across the bridge. That's about north, not quite true north, but close enough. And we're going to look at a couple of these younger bears on the far side of the river from where I am. And this is just a bit of a light play fight. It's quiet. Jawing going on. Maybe they might swipe their paws at one another, but fairly gentle movements, indicating that these bears are fairly well fed. So even though these bears might be in that hyperphagic season, again, they can, just like humans, just like us, even though we might be hungry, we might be able to engage in different activities from time to time. So it's definitely not uncommon to see younger bears playing at this time of the year. This area across the river from where I am, again, I'm standing on an elevated wildlife viewing platform, so I can stand here while bears walk beneath me, and I'm out of their line of travel. I'm certainly not in the river competing with them for space, although my presence here may alter the behavior of some bears. This is certainly a safe place for me. It's a place where bears can get used to my presence. But the floating bridge and the trail on the other side of the river, there's a trail in the woods just through there. You might be able to see it just kind of sneaking back. There's a sign and then a trail. This is an area that's a very big bottleneck for people and bears. So we haven't seen anybody come across the bridge towards us this morning, and that's because there's too many bears in the woods for anyone to find a clear route across. Here at Katmai, you cannot approach a bear within 50 yards, which isn't really that far of a distance. If you watch a football game on TV and you look at 50 yards and think that's very far, it's actually not. It's actually not that far, especially when you're staring a brown bear in the face. but this area provides brown bears with such ample feeding opportunities right now that it can be difficult to get to where you want to go because there are so many bears in the vicinity. It's really one of the things that makes Brooks Camp a unique place in national parks. So it's a little hard to see those younger bears still engaging in a bit of play, as well as some fishing on that far side of the bridge. There's 3 right there. So 2 in the water, 1 up on the other side of the bridge gates. You can kind of see it just sitting there through the bridge gates. It's a little hard to see. The ones in the water are still engaging in a bit of play. I don't know if the third one is really going to join in or not. Meanwhile, 409 is still going about her business, slowly moving upstream. I don't think my microphone was able to pick it up, but she was tearing into a spawned out fish just a moment ago, and I can actually hear the bones breaking as she bit into that. If you've ever filleted a salmon, you realize that salmon skin can be quite tough. You need a sharp knife to do it well. So when I see the bears pull apart the fish with ease, it really does demonstrate just a little bit of their strength. They are very muscular animals at any time of the year. Right now they're very fat, of course, so a lot of their muscles are covered over with body fat, and you really just can't see how strong they are unless they're demonstrating it. There is a ranger on the platform here. You may hear her voice from time to time. She's communicating via radio to some of the rangers on the other side of the river to let those rangers know where the bears are. We haven't really taken a look upstream. While we have our bears feeding, maybe a little bit of playing near the bridge, we'll take a look at some of the wildlife upstream. All these eddies and side channels of the lower Brooks River collect dead and dying salmon at this time of the year. So the river's current is much stronger. The gradient is steeper just around the bend from where I'm standing, just upriver. And when those salmon carcasses are brought downstream, when the river loses its energy, it can't, carry those carcasses as far. So all these meanders and side channels, the marshy areas in the grasses, salmon will get caught in those areas, and bears have learned that it's a great place to exploit those dead and dying fish. The dead and dying fish, of course, aren't worth as many calories as a salmon fresh from the ocean. They're probably, at best, contain about half the calories, but still a semi-fresh spawned out salmon can give you, a couple thousand calories or so if you were a bear to eat the whole thing. So moving through this area for a few hours in the morning can definitely give you many thousands of calories if you're good and efficient at scavenging. This is an older sub-adult bear. I'm going to take a look through my binoculars. I think this could be number 719. I might be mistaken about that, so don't if you're keeping track at home, don't take that as the absolute truth, because right now I'm just seeing its head. Sometimes I can recognize them by their facial features, their ear shape, ear color, things like that. It can be difficult from time to time as well, but this is certainly not a bear that looks to be as young as some of the others that we were looking at, just based on its size, a little bit larger. But showing us the same types of behavior, moving through the river very slowly, looking for anything that can't swim away, and is currently successful in finding a spawned out fish. Our our trio of younger bears continues to do the same thing they have been doing for the past 10 minutes or so. So right at the bridge gates on the far side, one sitting there watching two play. The two that are playing are actually in the water just on the upstream side of the bridge. This is a floating bridge, so there's just little pontoons on the bottom of it. It's anchored into the bottom using those metal poles, so there's little augers that they sort of screw down into the river gravel. The gates on the bridge do a pretty good job of preventing bears from climbing on the bridge, but sometimes it does happen. I've certainly seen it. But they don't really have a strong motivation to go on the bridge. If they wanted to, they could, but the gates, they see it and they're like, it's just not worth it. So they usually stay off of it. But it is certainly not a safe wildlife viewing platform. And these are small bears, but the gates on the bridge over there are, probably 3.5 feet high. So they give you a little indication of the size of these young animals. When you see these next to adult bears, they definitely look fairly small. But again, when you're on the trail or you're moving through the area here, or even standing on the wildlife viewing platforms and you look at them, they definitely are not tiny animals. And they'll continue to grow throughout their lives. Adult females don't get nearly as big as adult males. It seems like they have to devote their more of their resources towards raising their cubs, so they can't contribute, as many calories towards growing larger. And that's not the case with adult males. So since adult males don't have any role in actually raising cubs, then they can contribute they can continue to grow throughout much of their lives. Now, number 409 has swum closer to us, giving us a great view of how she'll eat this fish. So often bears will open the carcass by stripping the skin off. They'll eat the tail. They'll eat all of the fish if they're hungry enough. When they're less hungry, they may just eat some of the fattier parts of the fish, the skin, the brain, and the eggs. This one is again a spawned out salmon, so it's already finished its life cycle, so there won't be any eggs left in there. The 409 is a beautiful, large adult female, fairly recognizable because of those blonde ears. And she has a slightly upturned muzzle. She's also seen quite frequently at the mouth of the Brooks River at this time of the year. In July, she will fish the lip of Brooks Falls. So if you're familiar with that webcam and you're watching that from time to time, next year you might be able to see her on the lip of the waterfall. She also could be a mother next year, so she's single on her own. She emancipated her cubs this spring, and then bears, in late spring, it's the peak of their mating season. So that's when she would have been in estrus. So she could be carrying around some fertilized, basically some fertilized eggs right now. But bears go through a process called delayed implantation, where they won't, those fertilized eggs won't implant in the uterus until she goes to her den. And that process allows her to devote her resources towards gaining weight instead of growing new cubs within her body. And the cubs are really born at kind of the perfect time of the year for how small and vulnerable they are. They're only about a pound when they're born. And a big adult female like this at this time of the year could easily weigh 600 pounds or more. She's working that fish over quite efficiently. You will see, again, I think I mentioned this before, but you will see bears every once in a while pick up a fish and then just drop it. It's maybe just not quite fresh enough. They can afford to be choosy when there's a lot of food around. And we'll zoom out here just a little bit so we can catch a view of her. She's certainly the bear that's closest to where I am standing. She found just another fish just on the upstream side of the bridge there. But it looked like that one was not quite as palatable as the last one, so she dropped it, left it drift downstream. We've had some really wonderful sightings of bears on our underwater camera. So when that turns on live after this broadcast, you want to get an idea of how bears swim. You can watch that from time to time. It is really nice to watch them. So it's really hard to tell what legs she's using there and how hard she's working to swim across the river. But she's doing a very efficient doggy paddle. So just using her front legs, a lot of times brown bears, most of the time I should say, they will when they're swimming in the water, they won't use their hind legs. They'll just propel themselves using their front legs. Sticking her face in the water, this is a snorkeling technique that's universally used by bears at this time of the year. They don't have any special adaptations that allow them to see under the water, like nictitating membranes or something like that would help to make the view more clear. But the salmon stick out fairly well from the dark river bottom, especially the sockeyes that are red. Other salmon species will be of different colors, but they stand out fairly well from the bottom of the water. And they can also fish by feel too, so sometimes where the water is shallow enough, they will just be walking through, feeling the bottom, especially when it's dark at night and they can't really see very well. The bear activity is much less active during the dark hours of night, but they can be active, during those hours. But most of the time they are sleeping, especially at this time of the year. Oops, sorry. I was scanning through my binoculars and 409 drifted just out of our view there, so I apologize for that shoddy camera work. But this bear, again, very experienced in this area, knows how to fish here, knows where to find fish. So sometimes people will wonder, well, why are the bears down here? Why aren't they up at the waterfall fishing? Well, there's limited space up at Brooks Falls, even though we have seen many bears still fishing there, higher than average numbers of brown bears still fishing at Brooks Falls this year. But down here, food resources are much more dispersed. You just have to look slightly harder for them. You can't afford for the salmon to wait to come to you in this area, so you have to look. But it's still very easy to make a living down here. So in the past 10 minutes, 409 found and consumed at least 2 fish. So she's getting several, 1,000 calories out of those two salmon. And she's been fishing and swimming down here for, well, at least an hour that I have seen, and she may have been fishing longer. So certainly making a profit in calories this morning. I'm not sure if you were able to see that, but she did pick up a fairly rotten fish and drop it. By early October, they're going to be less likely to do that because there's going to be less fresh fish, or fewer fresh fish around. And if you can see, the skin on this fish is actually quite pale. That's an indication, from a distance, not only is this fish dead, so that's an indication that it's spawned out, but the pale colored flesh is also a good indication of that. The pigments that make salmon flesh pink, for example, if you buy a sockeye salmon at the market and you cook it and it has that nice pink flesh, those pigments are transferred to the skin of the fish when they spawn. So that's how they attain that bright red coloration of a spawning sockeye salmon. So the texture, the color of the flesh changes quite dramatically from when they first arrive to when they spawn. And it's an indication of just how hard they are working to spawn. When salmon re-enter freshwater, they do not eat. And these fish most of these sockeye salmon have been here for several weeks now. Some of them could have arrived in early July or mid-July. So they're in the water here, avoiding predators, digging their nests, competing for nesting sites with other salmon, all without eating. So their freshwater journey is completely fueled by the energy stores in their body. And 409 did such a good job of sort of filleting that fish that she left the swim bladder intact. And it's just kind of buoying some of the entrails downstream. But she only had to move a few feet before she found another fish to snack on. This fish actually looks a little bit fresher, at least according to the color of the flesh. Let's zoom in and take a look. This is a sockeye salmon that she's eating. Not as bright red as the ones that are spawning. So this one probably is still maybe a spawned out fish, but the color of that flesh again isn't as pale as what we normally see. Bears can eat the entire fish, all the bones, of course, all the entrails. They can eat the mandibles, the gill plates, some of the boniest parts of the fish, and all those pass through their digestive tract fairly well. So while 409 is being very, very efficient in gaining calories, possibly to support her cubs if she has any this winter, which is a possibility. We have these younger bears on the far side over here, still interacting, some wrestling happening, a little bit of play fighting. So one moving away. Again, these are all fairly young. So 2.5, maybe 3.5 years old at most. Play is such a important part of the lives of a lot of young bears. If they don't encounter other bears to find a partner, a sparring partner, then they will sometimes play with sticks, with rocks, any sort of novel object that they find in their environment. That's an important reason here why at Brooks River you can't leave any property unattended. So everything must be secured inside of a hard-sided building when it is not being physically carried by you. And this prevents bears from learning that we have fun things to play with, which certainly can be a consequence. If they find a bag or something like that laying on the ground, it's strange to them, it's different. And when they do play with things, they don't play nice, like the way we would consider nice play to be. So they will often destroy those things in their efforts to investigate it. Besides being fun, of course, play helps develop strength and coordination. The movements of play, and I do call it play fighting in a lot of instances because it does really mimic real fights that they'll have when they're engaged in a defensive encounter or something like that. So it probably does help them to hone their skills in case they need to defend themselves in the future. It looks like that play encounter is done for just the moment. And looking around, we have these two younger bears on the far side. The third one from that trio is moving upriver right now. .409, probably the largest and most mature bear that I see in my line of sight right now. So she's the one in the foreground. And then they're going to be hard to see in the camera's view, but a couple of younger bears also upstream of us. And if you're joining the broadcast late, my name is Mike Fitz. I am a fellow with Explore.org and the Bear Cams. And I am coming to you live from Katmai National Park, Alaska, specifically at the mouth of Brooks River. This is a very important place for bears to feed at this time of the year. And they're fishing for dead and dying salmon or anything that really just can't swim away from them. So salmon are their most important and abundant food resource. Most of their yearly calories for this sort of subgroup of Katmai's bears comes from salmon. The abundance and densities of bears that we see here in Katmai National Park is largely dependent on salmon. if there were no salmon here, bears would still, some bears at least, would still be able to make a living, but there would be far fewer brown bears here. And these are wild brown bears. They do have a hard life. They receive no veterinarian care or supplemental feed if there's a lean year with not as many fish. But overall, these bears do have access to much higher amounts of food than bears in other populations. So while bears in some areas of North America are getting fat primarily on berries or insects dispersed across the landscape, maybe digging edible roots or less caloric food on a pound per pound basis, these bears can afford to swim through the water and pick up even a dead salmon that contains a couple thousand calories, so they don't have to work nearly as hard, and that is reflective in their overall fatness. And we'll get an example of that, I think, right down below here in just a moment. There's a bear that's going to walk into our frame, hopefully. So let me pan down. I'm going to try to lean the camera forward here so we get a better view. It's going to be right below us. I don't know if we're going to be able to see it. There's the webcam. There it is. So again, another younger bear. A lot of these younger bears are difficult to identify because they grow so much from year to year. The adults seem to, in many cases, seem to have more distinctive facial features or more accentuated facial features, making them easier to identify. They also have a lot of scars. This bear does have this younger bear does have a scar on its right hip, which makes it fairly recognizable, though. So we do see this bear moving through the area. We saw it in July. We saw it there. Of course, we're seeing it right now, and it looks somewhat motivated to swim. So when it walked down here, it didn't look too wet. So maybe it hadn't gone fishing yet this morning. And when it's walking through the water the way it was, it probably was standing on its hind legs. Generally, when they're swimming with, laying with all fours, their faces are going to be much closer to the water. Now it's right underneath the bridge, so I'm not going to be able to give you a good view until it decides to move back into our line of sight. So still at least, 5 bears within my line of sight. The one at the bridge, one of the younger bears that was engaging in a play fight earlier on the far side, moving back towards the river. Again, engaging in that snorkeling behavior, looking for anything that can't swim away. And you might hear a magpie squawking. There's one right below me on the ground. Bears help to facilitate the movement of salmon nutrients and energy throughout the ecosystem. Of course, they do that through their scat and their urine as they eat fish in the water. Of course, they carry, fish in through their digestive tracts up into the forest, where they will deposit it later. But they also leave salmon carcasses on the riverbank, and that allows a lot of scavenging birds to take advantage of the situation. That's really the reason why we have so many gulls around here, so many eagles. A let's say a 5 pound sockeye salmon is a pretty big catch for a bald eagle. So most often I see the bald eagles here waiting for bears to leave parts of fish behind so they can swoop in and collect the rest. We still have that one bear. He's right at the bridge. Okay, there it comes out. I was waiting for it to give us a better view. And there are several bears in the woods over there. Some of the ones we were watching before have moved off into the woods. Again, no one has crossed the river since I've been here this morning because there have been too many bears in the forest on that other side. If you are planning a trip to Brooks River in the future, that is something to keep in the back of your mind. Do pack your patience along with some warm clothing because it can be cold and chilly here no matter the time of the year. But bears sometimes do, use the areas, or not sometimes, often use the areas near our facilities, our buildings, our trails. And it's not uncommon to have to wait sometimes an hour or more for bears to move out of the way before you can try to get to your destination. Well, this bear moves away. Pan upstream again. So we still have several bears in this area, including two that are play fighting, another pair separate from the ones we had seen before. A couple of younger bears. Again, these are subadult bears, so they're not quite mature. So subadults generally between the ages of 2.5 and 5.5 years old. And technically they wouldn't be considered adults until they reach sexual maturity. But like in humans, there's no exact set age when that happens. But generally around around 5 or 6 years of age. Although a female brown bear may not, give birth until several years later. At least we don't observe them with cubs until several years later. So whether they, have cubs and then they can't, keep those cubs alive until they arrive at Brooks River, we really don't know. But often it's not uncommon for us to see a female bear arrive here with her first litter, at age 7, 8, sometimes even 9 years old. Every once in a while you will see on television, a play fight like this, and then they dub in roaring noises. They make it sound like these bears are actually fighting. But take a closer look at the nature of the movements. You'll see that it's a bit more gentle, even though there can be some biting and some clawing. And when they play fight, they're generally quiet. They may make a little bit of huffing noises and things like that. If one annoys another and gets a little too aggressive, then they might growl just a little bit. But generally, these play fights are very quiet. And the water is often a great medium for them to do that because it helps to support the weight of their body. Again, they don't really have to worry too much about getting cold in the water because they are well insulated from it due to their body fat. And that's one of the fun things about watching bears here at Brooks River. You get to see a lot of the hardships that they face in their lives, and certainly this is a tough place to live. But every once in a while you get to see, some of the joy in their life as well, especially when they engage in a prolonged play fight like this.
one bear coming downriver is just about the 50-mile mark. So we may have to hold him back. We just opened up, we have one bear that's holding around the 50-yard line, and we have a lot of people coming across right now.
409 still swimming below us here. She hasn't moved very far in the past hour. She's moved less than a quarter mile straight line distance. She's maybe covered a little bit more than that by swimming back and forth. But she's eaten many, many fish, and I regret not keeping track this morning of how many fish that she's caught. But it's close to 5, at least during this broadcast. And it helps to really illustrate just how well fed that she is and why she can be so plump at this time of the year. Fatter females are more likely to have cubs, and they're going to have cubs at higher frequencies and larger litters. Now the rangers are trying to get people back and forth across the river. So you may hear some vehicle noise. You're going to hear other voices because there's definitely a herd of people moving towards me. So all of these people have been on the other side of the river all morning trying to do some bear viewing from this side. .409 is a very human habituated brown bear, meaning she's fairly used to the presence of people. So she's less likely to react to the noise, the activity, but there are a lot of brown bears here that you can't say that is true of. In fact, many brown bears in this area will not come down into this vicinity during the daytime because of all the people and the noise. So even though you come here to Brooks River and you try to be benign, it's very important to make sure that you're viewing brown bears from predictable locations. You're trying to be quiet as best you can. These, sort of, you may not be able to see, or, I don't think the camera really captured all of the chaos that sort of ensues here at the river. But it's definitely not, an uncommon situation for something like this to happen. You can see one of the park employees trying to hustle across the bridge because there can be many bears in the woods on the far side. So sometimes the windows to go back and forth across the river can be quite short. So 409's moved a little bit out of our line of sight.